Welcome to this week's Socially Distant Who the Folk podcast, sponsored by Gold Group Realty. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week we are joined by the Honorable Chief Judge Susan Segal of the Minnesota Court of Appeals. We talk about her appointment to the bench last November, how public service is in her blood, and how her Jewish values guide her in the law on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Judge Susan Segal, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I am very honored to be here.
So you are a judge on the Minnesota Court of Appeals, recently named the Chief Judge on the Court of Appeals. So Mazel Tov on that promotion from judge to chief judge. Were you surprised when Governor Walz named you to be the new chief judge on the court?
I was extremely honored by the confidence. Yeah, he's shown in me. It'll be a fun and interesting challenge. It's a great court packed with really smart, dedicated people.
So being a judge is not something you've done for very long. You've had a long career as an attorney, and working at various stops. You're a Minneapolis city attorney. You worked in private practice, and in this past November, so only 6 months ago or so, is when Governor Walz first tabbed you to be on the court. Why were you interested in making the move from attorney to judge?
I loved my job as the Minneapolis city attorney. It was interesting and challenging, and you could just look around and see the impact that we were having. But when there was this vacancy announced for the Minnesota Court of Appeals, it just seemed like a great new challenge. And I think it's good also from time to time. I'd been Minneapolis city attorney for 12 years, for somebody else to take the reins and to introduce their own ideas and leadership there. And it's been a really rewarding, albeit humbling, experience being at the Minnesota Court of Appeals. In my first few weeks with my first few calendars, I think I learned more prongs of legal tests for different things than I had since I was studying for the bar exam when I just graduated from law school. So the breadth of kinds of cases and issues that come to that court and the volume, because every week, more or less, each judge is involved in deciding 6 cases, which involves review, sometimes of a full trial record. But it's been fun and interesting. I've had to polish off my elements of style to try to, because you do a lot of writing and editing, and so I've really enjoyed that.
It takes you back to your 1L legal writing days, I'd imagine.
Exactly. And let's see. Oh, wait a minute. This is the passive voice. I need to be active. All those lessons from teachers from years ago in high school English I'm trying to recreate.
So the learning curve is pretty steep for something like this, huh?
Yes, I think it is, actually.
I would think it would be.
It's like exercising old muscles, like you haven't ridden a bicycle in a long time. And then the other thing that's been an interesting transition for me is going from being an advocate where you knew your side of the case and you were just trying to develop your best arguments, to having to decide what's the right thing to do in this case. What are the precedents? And it is a different role, and the style of writing is different also.
So I'd imagine the view is got to be very different, having spent so many years on the other side, facing the bench. Now you're sitting on the bench facing out. I'd imagine it probably was slightly disorienting at the start, right?
Well, at the start, when I had my very first oral argument, and you walk out, and I wasn't quite sure exactly where to sit, and I had a borrowed, I think it was from some old moot court argument, but it was like an old high school graduation gown because there was a problem with ordering the regular gown, not because of the wonderful staff at the Court of Appeals. There was an issue with the vendor. Um, and I was just afraid that I would burst out laughing, like I'm some imposter, pretend, like it's a moot court.
Right,
Like, who am I
right.
to be sitting here judging? And then, oh, when should I ask my first question? But you quickly get over that and really get into the legal issues and arguments and really trying to understand the lawyer's different positions.
So, what are some of the different types of cases that you've been lucky enough to hear in your 6 months so far on the bench?
Yeah, quite a variety. I mean, DWI cases, family law cases, murder cases. So with the really quite a variety of civil and criminal cases. So it really is an ongoing, I mean, it's an interesting mix. It's a very interesting mix, and you never know what you're going to get, with each calendar.
So, I think a lot of people may not understand a lot about the judicial system. I know I don't understand, and I think everybody sort of sees the U.S. Supreme Court, and then they know their state Supreme Courts. Where does the Minnesota Court of Appeals sort of fall in the hierarchy of courts within the state? Where does it,
Well,
somewhere between like district court and Supreme Court, or how does
well,
it all work?
Lonnie, yes. Technically, we are what's called an intermediate court of appeals, but I think we are the most important court. Don't tell any of the Minnesota Supreme Court justices I said that.
Wouldn't dream of
Um,
it.
because we wind up, so you have a right to appeal to our court. Review except for example, first degree murder cases. Um, Review in the Minnesota Supreme Court is discretionary with that court. So we are the last say in a little over 95% of all cases that are appealed, because the Supreme Court is selective in which cases they accept, as they should be, um, because they are changing potentially the law of the state for quite a while with each decision that they accept. So, and we see the full range of all cases coming from state administrative agencies or local government, for example, uh, you know, revocation of business licenses, those kinds of appeals. Um, uh, so everything from the district courts, state administrative agencies, and local government when they're acting in what's called a quasi-judicial fashion.
So, if one of the parties wants to appeal one of your rulings or one of your brethren on the Court of Appeals, then it goes to then the next step up is the state Supreme Court if the state Supreme Court chooses to hear it.
That's exactly right. And then if there's a federal question, like a federal constitutional issue, then they can uh, petition for review in the United States Supreme Court.
Okay. So, what is the difference between your role as a judge versus chief judge?
Well, people call you chief. That's one thing, which I wasn't used to people calling me judge. I'm very happy with Susan. Um, but um, uh, other than that, there's administrative responsibilities
Okay.
that go along with it. Now, particularly with the current pandemic, making sure that um, uh, we can proceed forward with our work and keep everybody safe. Dealing with budget the Judicial Council, which is the governing body for the state courts, has already put in a hiring freeze, and we're all looking at other measures for how we can save budget resources. So there's an administrative component that comes along with it. And there are 19 judges on the Court of Appeals, and we're a very collegial group, which is really important because we sit in a panel of three. And so we might disagree, on the outcome of a particular case, which but we respect each other's opinions, and we can come out of that conference and still remain really good friends, and that's important in terms of coming to the best decisions. And then we really operate the court by group consensus, and so we have bench meetings, and there are subcommittees to deal with different issues. But I'm really lucky to be taking over as chief now after Chief Judge Cleary's just steady, wise leadership over the last 6.5 years. We've got a talented group of judges and talented staff. So I feel really lucky in that regard.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I think obviously so much attention is paid to the executive branch and the legislative branch of the state government during this time. How does the judicial branch operate? Are you still in session in a courtroom? Are you doing everything by teleconference? How is the court able to maintain itself right now?
Right. Well, the biggest impact is at the district court level, because all jury trials have been delayed until at least June 1st, according to the last order from our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So there's been a lot of things deferred and delayed. I know that they're doing matters that they can remotely, particularly in civil cases, arguing motions. I think that work can continue. Obviously, there are things, like bail review. There's still people being arrested for
Yeah,
crime, and
sure.
their constitutional rights, have to be respected. Um, and then at our level, with the stay-at-home order still in place, we've been more or less operating the court remotely. We have been continuing calendars virtually without interruption, and have been doing oral arguments using the WebEx platform,
Mm-hmm.
and that seems to be working pretty well. We're all very dependent on the quality of the internet, where the lawyers are and where the judges are. But we've been, the Court of Appeals has pretty much been operating at the same pace it was pre-COVID, but just really relying heavily on technology and internet connection.
Well, it's good to see that at least the infrastructure seems to be in place to be able to do that.
Right. No, we're lucky, and VPN system, I think, was just installed for the Court of Appeals a year ago, and we couldn't do it without that.
Oh no, not at all.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Are you tired of paying rent and want to learn how to own a cash flowing property where a renter helps subsidize your living expenses? Reach out to the team at Gold Group Realty and schedule a coffee to learn what it takes to make your first investment in real estate and get you to stop paying rent. Find the Gold Group at www.thegold.group today.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, how do your Jewish values, how have they sort of played a role in shaping the types of either the type of law or the types of clients you take on, and now looking at your time as a judge and your future as a judge, how they sort of help shape that, just your understanding of the law?
Right. In really profound ways. Not that I'm the most profound person, as my boys will tell you, um, but but the whole sense of mercy and compassion, uh, that sense of understand. I'm a white woman, but my Jewish religion and ethnic background, I think, has helped me try to understand a little bit what it's like to be, uh, a quote other, and how people can be marginalized, how systems can work against them. And so that's been really helpful to me, as well as when I first started practice, I started practicing with a firm out in Washington, D.C., and I happened to work very closely with a Jewish partner out there. And and there were several of them, and you could hear them, yelling down the hallways at each other. And I'll never forget the first time I heard about the writ of Rahmanis. And it's like, well, I didn't learn about that in law school. But but it's where you throw yourself on the mercy of the court. So
Yeah.
it's such a rich heritage, um, that it I just value it greatly. And I also value the Jewish sense of humor, which has helped me through many a tight spot during my life.
So, among the other sort of important parts of being named chief judge, you're the second woman to be to serve as chief judge. That's pretty fantastic. Also, a little, possibly alarming that there have only been you and one other woman as chief judge in the court's history. But obviously, that's still a remarkable milestone.
Thank you very much. No, I am. It is just quite an honor, and it's great at this point in my career to be learning and growing and exploring new things. And uh, Judge Jennifer Frisch, I was able to swear into our court on Monday. She was the assistant chief judge at Ramsey County District Court, and she is also Jewish. So we now have two Jewish uh, judges on the Court of Appeals, and there are very few Jewish judges in the appellate courts of the state of Minnesota. And so I always thought Judge David Strass was the first, but I understand that Tom Sipkins, who's sort of the court historian on the Minnesota Board of Judicial Standards and a former judge, says actually no, that there was another Jewish judge, appellate judge,
Okay.
prior to Judge Strass. So I would then be number 3, and Judge Frisch would be number 4 in the
That's
history of
not
the state of Minnesota.
that's not a lot.
No, it's not. No, it's
That's
not.
not.
Yeah.
Well, it's it's really interesting. I think it's interesting to hear you talk about sort of just the transition from attorney to judge and what that's been like. And obviously, this is not the time we're living in. This can't be what you imagined it was going to be. When you took the appointment and then obviously the promotion to chief, it's definitely an interesting time to be living in. Period. But to be serving as chief judge, this has to be not quite what you had thought it was going to be like so far.
No, that's exactly right, and it adds challenges because one thing I'd been thinking about, and we'd actually discussed it at our last bench meeting a couple months ago, was how can we increase outreach and engagement and connect more with the affinity bar associations, whether it's the Black Lawyers or American Indian Bar, or the
Mm-hmm.
Cardozo Society. Um, and Obviously, we're going to have to come up with new ways and new plans, and then planning for how long do we continue to operate the way that we are, and when things relax a bit, what's the safest way to allow people back into the judicial center. We've got a whole new crop of law clerks who are supposed to start near the end of August. And generally we have, one big training session for a week with all of them. And how can we manage that, while keeping them safe? And can we do that remotely? Any rate, but all these issues are very minor compared to what so many others have to deal with. And so I think we all feel very lucky, and that this is all just very manageable for us. The much more complicated task in the court system is at the district court level, because it's so hard to figure out how do you do a jury trial. How does the jury deliberate? Because you can't, even 6 feet apparently is apart is not enough if you're in a confined area in a enclosed room for a period of time, that you need
Sure.
even greater social distancing.
Right.
There's
You need a really big jury room, and I can't
there you
imagine
go.
those
There
are
you
available.
go. Yep. No, we might be running out, James. Who knows? I don't know.
Well, Chief Judge Susan Segal, thank you very much for joining us. I have last 2 questions I gotta ask you before we let you go, though. What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, I would have to say Passover. We've had a lot of fun with Passover Seders over the years, and I recently reconnected with some of my law school friends who reminded me I was put in charge at the first one at law school of making matzo ball soup. And I had never made it on my own before. And we wound up with giant matzo balls and very little soup. So, so that's my favorite. And we've, actually my dad died this August not from COVID, but
Uh,
at the age of 97. But last Passover was the last one he helped preside over. And we had Governor Tim Walz there. We had Attorney General Keith Ellison and Council Member Jeremiah Ellison. So it just over the years, and my mother was a state representative, Gloria Segal. She would invite, she was an advocate for mental health, and is responsible for a lot of the groundbreaking legislation in the mental health area in the state of Minnesota. But she had a habit of, if she came across somebody, she'd invite them over for Passover. So I think one of my husband's first big, large family gatherings before we got married was Passover at my parents' house. And he kind of looked around the room and wondered if they were all in our gene pool, because she would invite homeless people over, people, with active mental illness. And
wow.
but she was quite the person. So at any rate, so definitely Passover.
So before I ask the last question, though, public service very much runs in the blood. It came, it's part of the family business then.
Yes. And that actually was part of my motivation for how I got into the public law business and public service, was working for Amy Klobuchar when she was the Hennepin County attorney during her second term. And I
Okay.
was in private practice at the time, and she asked me if I was interested in becoming one of her 2 deputies to help manage the civil side of the office. And I'd been kind of trying to figure out how to get into public service, because it had always interested me. And so that's when I made the switch. And I have just learned so much and enjoyed it so much. It's just been great. And I
That's
actually got
fantastic.
my husband into the public service business too, which
What
I
is he
think
doing? What does he do?
he's the management and budget commissioner for Governor Walz, but he started as the revenue commissioner for Governor Dayton, and
Okay.
I thought Myron was a little bored in his tax litigation practice at the time, and um, knew the people who were involved in helping Governor Dayton put together his cabinet, and asked him if the revenue commissioner slot had been filled yet. Um, and so he's been in public service now for almost 10 years and is working like a dog basically around the clock
I'm sure.
since the
I'm
pandemic started.
Oh, I'm sure. I think both you and your husband are definitely testaments to the idea that you're never too old to learn something, and it's never too late to change careers
There you
and
go.
change job focus, because obviously you've both done that recently, and it's to great effect. So there are very important lessons there for people.
Yep. You can't, or we're just too dumb to know when to quit.
I would never suggest that. All right, last question now before I forget it. What is your favorite Jewish food?
Oh, wow. Well, between noodle-kugel and matzah brie, which I know are a little odd, but there you have it.
No, those are no problem with those. Those are excellent choices. You can't go wrong with either.
There you go.
Well, Chief Judge Susan Segal, thank you so much for joining us this week. We wish you continued success in your new role as Chief Judge of the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and stay safe and healthy out there.
Lonnie, thanks so much, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Gold Group Realty for sponsoring this week. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the show. If you have someone who you think should be on the podcast, please email me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. The Who the Folk podcast is a product of Jewfolk Inc. and part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network. For more shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.